we're all set, so go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to Ain't It Scary with Sean and Carrie. We do a podcast every week. We are a married couple from Connecticut. We love talking about all things macabre, and that's kind of what a lot of our conversations turn toward, the grim and the dark anyway. So we decided to buy a couple of microphones and just let the internet in on our the talks we were basically having anyway.
Typical marriage stuff.
Yeah, so weekly we gather in our little makeshift podcast studio, and one of us will have heavily researched a topic, and the other one will know very, very little, ideally, about that thing. And then we try to get into what's going on. Ideally, we talk about stuff that has maybe multiple explanations.
Yeah, we just did a very long series on the Manson family at the end of this summer, and that was my undertaking, I guess you could say. And now Sean is doing a series on historical vampires and vampire lore for the spooky season. So we're always doing true crime, the paranormal, anything weird, historical, stuff like that, including UFOs in space.
Yep, UFOs, space, alien abductions, all well within our bailiwick. We really like this stuff. So we prepared a little presentation for you. Let's pull it up here. UFOs of New England and beyond. We're going to have a New England focus here today, but some of the best stories. We just have to share some of these stories. So to get us started, that's us, first of all. That's just to prove that we are quite spooky. That's one of our engagement photos. So, but into the topic at hand, UFO stands for, and if you guys didn't have, I appreciate everybody's muted to, because that's how these kinds of things work. But if you weren't, I would probably hear everybody saying unidentified flying object, and that's right. You're all very smart. Great job. It doesn't necessarily mean flying saucers. It doesn't necessarily mean little green men or alien life. But the phrases come to, really be strongly associated with these fun stories about alien life, which is probably why government types and other people who want to sound like they're talking about a very serious phenomenon that needs to be taken very seriously. The trendy thing now is to use the phrase UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, but that just means the same thing as UFO, and we think UFO is more fun. So that's the term that we're going to use throughout this. But you'll see UAP in the news and stuff. They mean the same thing, just as a side note. Also, somebody who studies these objects calls themselves a ufologist. There's not a ton of money in ufology, but it is a job that people do. And uapologist doesn't really roll off the tongue as well. So I think ufologist, I think that's going to stick around. But the UFO craze in the US really started in 1947. And I know what some of you are thinking, but no, not in Roswell, New Mexico. Instead, it really kicked off with Kenneth Arnold. That's this dapper fella on the left here, pointing to an artist rendering of what he supposedly saw that day in 1947. Arnold was a salesman and a private pilot, hobbyist pilot, I guess, from Idaho. And he really kicked off the post-war fascination with UFOs in the US when he reported seeing a group of saucer-shaped craft on June 24th of 1947. He was flying from Chehalis to Yakima, Washington on a business trip. Remember, he can fly his own planes, so that makes it a little easier to get from A to B on business. But he saw flashing blue light, like a reflection, out on the horizon. But he said when he checked, visually, the only plane in his vicinity was an airliner that was about 15 miles away. And then the object disappeared, but about 30 seconds later, Arnold saw a long chain of bright reflective objects. He said they were too high and they were moving way too fast to be a flock of geese, but he also couldn't see the tails of jet planes. Arnold estimated these things were about 60 feet long, but he later ramped that up. He was like, you know what, there were mountains behind him. I think based on the scale, these had to be 100 feet long. Very large objects, and he said they were flipping around erratically. They were flying in a diagonally stepped echelon formation, like you'd see a flock of geese, but zipping around and then finally zipping out of sight.
And that's sort of a hallmark of a lot of these most interesting stories, is that these flying objects, despite the fact that, yes, technology does exist that we're not familiar with, they seem to be making maneuvers that are impossible or completely unknown to the general public, at least, in terms of capabilities, just too fast, or whipping around, or stopping right on a hair, things like that. And that's what makes them so interesting to people, especially people like Arnold, who you would hope is very knowledgeable in what he should be seeing in the sky because he's a pilot.
And especially when you don't see wings or fins or any of the things that in 1947 all aircraft had, basically. Not helicopters. So Arnold's report was initially dismissed by the Air Force, and when they did eventually do an investigation, they concluded that, quote, the objects of this sighting were due to a mirage. But that didn't stop the media from having a field day, and America was introduced to the now very popular term flying saucers through newspaper headlines like this Chicago Sun-Times headline you can see there: supersonic flying saucers sighted by Idaho pilot. It's one of the first times that phrase ever appeared. But this kicked off a wave of reports. You can see at the top of the slide there, I've called it the 1947 flying disc craze, but that's what they called it. You can see in a picture actually from Roswell on the right there, the disc craze continuing. At least 800 and probably more like thousands of reports came in across the late 40s, basically from 47 to like 51, of flying saucers in the sky, or flying saucers having crashed. And new saucer stories were a fixture in the newspapers basically every day. And all the while, the press, of course, was continuing to follow the aftermath of the Arnold case. Now, one of those later saucer stories came from Roswell, New Mexico. But it wasn't a UFO sighting proper. What you had was a rancher named Mac Brazel, who only heard about the saucer craze on July 5th of 1947 when he took a trip into town. And so Mac remembered, upon hearing about people seeing all these craft in the sky, he said, oh, you know what? And Mac remembered a pile of debris that he had found scattered across a square mile of his ranch about 3 weeks previously. It was made of tinfoil, rubber. There were some thin wooden beams and very curiously heavy paper. He said he couldn't tear the paper, but also that Scotch tape was heavily involved in the construction of this device. So Mac Brazel had gathered all this crap up basically and stuck it under some brush to get it out of the way. But now he went, oh, well, maybe there's something to this. He threw it in his truck and brought it to the local sheriff, like, hey, all those flying discs in the newspaper? Huh? The UFO craze would die down somewhat later in that same summer of 47, and Roswell was really forgotten until UFO interest kicked back up in the late 1970s. UFOs had a resurgence in the 70s, and then again in the 90s, and now again recently. It's like every 20, 30 years, just like bell bottoms, UFOs are back again. Mm-hmm. But later with Roswell, the conspiracy theory would morph to involve recovered alien bodies, after a Roswell mortician claimed that the military had asked him for advice about hermetically sealed caskets. Very suspicious when somebody asks you about medically sealed caskets. But that mortician, Glenn Dennis, later ran a UFO museum in Roswell. And that's, by the way, where that third picture on this slide comes from. That's not, as far as we know, a genuine alien body. I think that's a waxwork. It's from Glenn Dennis's museum in Roswell. That's getting into a whole other story. But if you must know, the official story on Roswell, the government story, is that debris was from a Project Mogul balloon. It was supposed to be detecting Soviet nuclear tests. You can believe that or not.
Exactly. So it might surprise all of you to know that UFO sightings aren't something that actually started in the 20th century, even with Roswell and Kenneth Arnold. In fact, we've been seeing UFOs, unidentified flying objects, in the United States and especially in the Northeast for about as long as we've been settled here. Even before American independence, during colonial times, there were accounts of UFOs. So we can start with the earliest major sighting that at least I could find, and it happened right in Massachusetts in 1639. So really, really far back here.
And there's a photograph there on the right, which is incredible.
It's a rendering. But this sighting was recorded by no less a figure than John Winthrop. And there's a little drawing of him there. He was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So in a lot of these situations, people like pilots with certain expertise or political figures, people with, respected names, their interpretations of events or their accounts are going to hold a little more weight because they are respected people.
Yeah, they have just more stake in it than
Clout,
Jerry, who works at the electrical plant and saw a light in the sky.
Sure. So John Winthrop, the Massachusetts governor, relayed a story by one James Everell, who Winthrop describes as a sober and discreet man, basically saying, like, this guy's legit, I believe him. And according to Winthrop's account of Everell's story, Everell had been rowing along the muddy river with two other men when a bright fiery light appeared in the sky in front of them. Winthrop said, quote, "When it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards square. When it ran, it was contracted into the figure of a swine." So a lot of these sightings, especially these very, very early ones, they had really no way of relating it to anything. Like we have, at least we could say, well, it wasn't a plane, it wasn't a helicopter, but they had no clue what anything in the sky could be. So maybe it looked like it was shaped like a pig. Who knows?
It's the kind of description I'd like a little more of in
Well,
modern days. I want more pigs flaming through the sky.
Oh, yeah, when pigs fly. Now, this trio watched this lit up swine type figure in the sky for 2 to 3 hours as it darted around the river area and the nearby village of Charlestown.
They didn't have a lot to do back then.
I mean, this must have blown their minds as well. They felt later on that they had lost time during this duration because once they broke from the shock of seeing this strange light, they found themselves carried against the tide about a mile upstream with no memory whatsoever of paddling that distance. And that's another really common thing in UFO sightings and abductions, is that time has passed with no concept that it has passed until later you realize, oh, it's been 5 hours. Where did that time go?
You will hear that again in this presentation, yes, for sure.
And Winthrop added of this sighting, diverse other credible persons saw the same light after at about the same place. So this is really the first so-called widespread UFO sighting, and it happened right in Massachusetts. And speaking of Massachusetts, one of the most major incidents in ufology, as you can call the study, occurred in Berkshire County on September 1st, 1969, Labor Day weekend. So pretty much this time of year. Now, just past dusk, there's a few different stories here. So we're going to start just past dusk with Jane Green, who was returning to Great Barrington from Stockbridge with a friend of hers named Mary. So they're driving down the highway and they come upon a bright light, which they thought might be the scene of an accident. She pulled over since she couldn't drive with the light in her eyes. She got out of the car with Mary to try and see what was going on. And at that point, she described a huge, tall, floating object, no windows and no noise, strangely enough, with no motor sound, just floating in front of them right above the highway. And within seconds, the craft lifted up, it really zigzagged fast and darted away over the nearby mountain. So that's kind of the first spot in the timeline of this very strange night that this whole county ended up having back in 1969. So next we go to Great Barrington with 10-year-old Tommy Warner, and that's him in the middle here at the late 60s when this took place. He's coloring at his neighbor's home. His neighbors are the Shaws. And as darkness falls, Tommy walks over to the window of the home And here he said that he heard a voice telling him clearly and commandingly, "You need to go home now." So he was frightened by this. There's nothing around that he could figure out where this voice was coming from. So he listened. He's still a child,
He couldn't figure out where this voice was coming from, so he listened?
Well, I mean, it sounded commanding.
Stay in the house, Tommy.
So he told the Shah's older daughter, Debbie, that he needed to go home. He wasn't sure why, and he just bolted from the house. He was very scared. So as he's running across the yard to his home, he is stopped by almost an invisible force, like an invisible wall almost. He couldn't move forward. He is stuck in place. And this is witnessed by Debbie, who is an older teenager. She had followed him out the door being like, "Well, what are you doing? Why are you running away?" And so she sees him kind of running in place like he's being held by invisible hands. So eventually, Tommy's able to break this stasis and he starts to go forward. But as he turns to look to his left, a UFO dropped out of the sky in front of him. And there's an artist's rendering based on descriptions of what people saw that night on the right here.
So this one isn't tall like the one like the girl saw on the road.
Well, it's massive, so it could be tall and is just also wide. But they did describe it as just humongous, but also eerily quiet.
And remember those details, that it was moving erratically, giant quiet machine, talking to people telepathically. These are all the things that we'll see over and over again with UFO stories.
Yes. And also a very classic image in a UFO story, a beam of light comes upon him that is directed from this UFO. It almost seems to control his body. And in a flash, Tommy is gone. He just disappears. And Debbie witnessed this whole thing and she was horrified. She's searching around for Tommy. She sees him have this light on him from this weird craft in the sky disappear. The craft disappears and she's left going, "Oh no, I was babysitting this kid. Where did he go?"
What am I going to tell his parents?
Yes. Now at nearby Lake Mansfield, around the same time, the family of 12-year-old Melanie Kirchdorfer had just parked in the lot after getting ice cream. Almost as soon as they settled in, a brilliant aura came around the car, frightening the children and probing Kirchdorfer's father to chase the bright light.
Probing him?
Well,
they're getting to that already?
No, influencing him. The next thing Melanie remembers, she's laid out on some kind of ship, as she recalls, where Tommy Warner spots her to his right. So they had gone to school together. They weren't in the same grade, but he recognized her. More children were in the same room, and they would disappear one by one as if they were being called down to something or leaving the craft. And eventually, Melanie was one of those kids that disappeared from the room. She woke up alone back at the lake with no one, including her family, remaining nearby. They had left trying to look for her. So she had to walk home. She was very scared.
How much time had passed?
I think it had been at least a couple hours.
I think they should still be at the lake.
I'll
be honest. I think they should still be at the lake.
I think they're in just such shock that she had disappeared. So they were looking for her. And then the next Tommy remembered, he was being laid carefully on the ground of the Shah's lawn where he had disappeared from by some kind of energy that was laying him down there, the beams shining upon him. And then he was able to stand and the craft disappeared. Now, the last piece of the puzzle is one of the most interesting. It takes place in Sheffield, further south, again, around the same time, same night. 9-year-old Tom Reed was in the car with his family, taking a shortcut through the Sheffield covered bridge. You can see that here. They're heading home after a busy day, celebrating Labor Day. There's a parade and all that. As they exit the bridge, the family spots a light rising from the banks of the Housatonic River. Tom's mother, Nancy, who also recalls this incident, describes it as a glowing ball of light hovering maybe 2 stories high, like the ball of light itself was 2 stories high. So very, very, very large. They had never seen anything like it. And as it rose, it fired off rods of light. And Tom's brother Matthew spotted some sort of roiling orange orb within the object, like it was an energy core of some kind.
What is he, an alien engineer? What does he mean like it's an energy core?
He's just trying to explain it in any way he can, I think. He was also a kid when he saw it. The atmosphere got very dense and almost high in pressure while in the car, like they were underwater almost. And everything, again, was extremely quiet. There was no sounds of a typical summer night going on. It was like they were in like a padded room almost, just no sound whatsoever. Nancy pulled off to the side of the road where she saw a disc-shaped object at least 100 yards long in the sky. It lit up the car like it had floodlights almost. And then the sounds of the typical summer night with chirping and rustling and things like that just erupted back into reality all at once, like they had gone off of mute. And that's the last thing the family remembers until they came to almost 1.5 miles away in front of a drugstore. Everything seemed normal again, except that Tom's grandmother was now in the driver's seat and Nancy was now in the passenger seat. And Tom's grandmother never drove. Nancy had been the one moments before sitting in the driver's seat, physically driving the car. So they had somehow swapped. The whole family lost this time. They didn't know how they got 1.5 miles away from where they were. Tom states that he can maybe account for that first 15 minutes of the original drive home, but 3 hours had passed once they were able to figure out what time it was.
It took a really long time to get grandma into that front seat.
Yes. No one had memories of these 3 hours, how they had gotten to the drugstore, or why Nancy wasn't driving the car anymore. It was almost like they had been placed back into the car, but in the wrong places, is how they described it. So that's one of the wildest New England UFO experiences. You can see more about that on the really great new version of Unsolved Mysteries that's on Netflix. They have interviews with all of these people, and they all seem very, very serious and straightforward about what they encountered that day.
Yeah, and if you don't have authority figure, we'll get to this in a minute with the Hudson Valley UFO incident. But when you don't have authority figures like, say, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony or a trained pilot telling you something's real, when a bunch of people all are saying the same thing happened on the same night, that also helps, especially if they experienced it in different places. Even though there's no physical evidence of this incident, it makes it a much more interesting thing, unless they're all lying.
Right. But as the children who are now adults, obviously, they all attested to the fact that they were bullied and made fun of after this experience, after sharing what had happened to them. Some of them had moved away afterward because they were so ostracized. So they really got nothing out of it, at least nothing positive. Now, we're going to take a trip to Vermont for our next UFO experience. This is commonly known as the Buff Ledge UFO encounter. And this, interestingly, happens around the same time. This is August 7, 1968, so just 1 year prior to the Berkshire incident. Michael and Janet, who this is pseudonyms, but they're taking a break from working at a private summer girls camp on Lake Champlain, north of Burlington. So they're counselors. They're lounging on the dock while many of the other counselors and campers were away on overnight trips in the area, enjoying time off. And Michael first spots a bright star-like object in the sky that he initially figured was Venus. But it began growing larger and getting closer and making very strange movements in the sky that obviously were not a stationary planet. He pointed out the object to Janet, made sure that she was seeing the same thing as him. And they started to see this sort of fantastical light show play out. The object swooped down in an arc, blossomed into a glowing white cigar shape. it came to a sudden stop. Then 3 small white lights came out of it, almost like drones or something like that. The main object vanished. The smaller lights are flying around, and they're swooping and diving in the sky in this area of the camp, which you can see a couple of pictures. So they're at the lakefront area, and they're watching this incredible thing happen in the sky that they can't explain. And it's coming closer to them, with one of those 3 lights advancing across the lake toward the pair. A band of light with hues across the spectrum is glowing out of it, rotating on the disc's edge. There's a strange admission of sounds in different pitches and tones. It kind of reminds me of like a Close Encounters of the Third Kind sort of musical situation.
They've got a whole rave coming at them is what it sounds like.
Yes. This light dives into the lake and then comes back, and it moves towards the dock where they're just these 2, I think, older teenagers are just sitting in shock, watching all of this. Michael stated later it seemed like it was the size of a small house, 40 to 50 feet wide, shaped like 2 curved saucers placed face to face.
No, they were supposed to be lifeguarding little Jason Voorhees when they swam. Isn't that correct?
Well, this was their off day, so they're just having UFO encounters.
Okay, maybe they're blameless.
And then Michael sees a transparent dome on top with 2 entities inside, which were large-headed and oval-eyed, the classic alien-looking creatures. They had 2 small nasal openings and small mouths. They might have had some sort of gray or silvery uniforms. And telepathically, again, a very common experience, they tell Michael that they're from a distant planet. They had made earlier visits to Earth around the time of the nuclear explosions in 1945, and that Michael was in no danger. Soon after, Michael and Janet pass out, and then they don't really know what happened after that at that point until Michael came to, still on the dock, but now it's completely dark outside, so time has passed.
Missing time. We're checking off the list. We're hitting the bingo card.
And this object is hovering in front of them still, so it's almost like it had dropped them back off in a way and was checking to see that they were okay. And
it's very nice.
At this point, some of the campers started to return for the evening, and 2 of them ran down to the dock screaming, seeing this object hovering above Michael and Janet. Reacting to these new people on the scene, the craft rose, directed its beam of light across the camp, almost like a spotlight, and then the object just darted away, disappeared from sight within seconds. Michael brought Janet back to her cabin. She was still very much out of it. And after that, they didn't speak of the incident. Michael supposed that Janet had been traumatized in some way until 10 years later. So at this point, UFO investigator Walter Webb was interviewing the pair separately for his book, Encounter at Buffledge, a UFO Case History. And you can see a copy of the book over here. Obviously, because of the multiple witnesses, word had gotten out of this story. So he wanted to sort of make the definitive version of it accessible. During these interviews, and also under hypnosis, which again is going to be something that helps draw out these memories supposedly, and
it is
incidents.
It is a theme. You'll hear hypnosis a few more times in this presentation, and the argument is that the experience of an abduction or of an encounter with these aliens is so traumatic and so jarring for your brain that you suppress some of these memories, and it takes hypnosis to draw them out. Is it possible some of those memories weren't there in the first place and now you think they are?
I mean, it just depends on how much credence you give hypnosis therapy.
I think hypnosis works, but I think some of these memories might be.
Yeah. So they do go under hypnosis for the first time to try and recover the memories about the experience, especially about that missing time. And Michael remembers during hypnosis seeing that they were abducted. Him and Janet were pulled onto what looked like a ship. He remembered seeing screens on the ship where the Earth, moon, stars, and a huge cigar-shaped ship were shown on them, almost like maps. There were different decks of this ship. On one of them, Janet was lying on a rectangular table with two of the same creatures he had seen in the dome examining her. He was led to a table to be examined himself, and then he lost consciousness. Eventually, a helmet-like object is placed on his head, in which he telepathically, he said, saw strange images of a strange landscape, including a purple sky, weird-looking trees and grass. He said it felt like they were showing him their planet.
They were also drying his hair.
Maybe. And then suddenly he felt like he was falling through a space of TV-like screens, almost like the facets of a fly's eye just fully surrounded them. And then he awoke back on the dock. Now, Janet, who hadn't remembered much of the initial incident, aside from the first moving lights and the approach of the big light towards them, recalled much more during her hypnotic regression. Most of her account was pretty much the same as Michael's. She remembers tests being conducted on them, and she remembers the same kind of screens that Michael reported, and they're being interviewed separately. So make of that what you will. And Webb, the author here, also talked to 11 former camp counselors and 7 former campers, including the ones that had first run down to the dock and saw the UFO leaving. And they all independently had vague memories of an unidentified object moving swiftly away from the waterfront. And it was described as quiet, dark, and circular with lights across its curved edge. There was even another witness who was completely unrelated to the camp, who had been driving in the area that night and had seen something similar in the sky and reported it, and he was also interviewed. So again, it's one of these very widespread encounters. It involves abduction and involves sightings, multiple people. It's a really fascinating, strange story.
In a lot of ways, it reminds me of Barney and Betty Hill, who we will talk about if we have time. They're not a New England story.
Actually, New Hampshire.
That's true. They are a New England story. Well, maybe we'll try and squeeze in Barney and Betty. Also not a New England story, but still here in the northeastern U.S. and just outside of New England. New York's Hudson Valley was home to one of the most widely reported and best attributed sightings in American history, and they kept happening for years.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Hudson Valley Triangle, or the Hudson Valley UFO. And between 1982 and 1987, over 5,000 people in the Hudson Valley and southwestern Connecticut reported seeing a massive triangular craft. It's most often described like you're seeing on the left here. Somewhere between 1 and 2 football fields long, with multicolored lights running down its 2 wings. The peak of the sightings were on several nights in March of 1983, and then several more nights in March of 1984, when literally roads full of motorists were reported as stopping and getting out of their cars to look at the lights flying overhead. Officials and investigators, this, by the way, so again, we did an episode on this if you want this story in more detail with our friends at the New York Mystery Machine podcast, which was very fun. But this is, again, picture looking up and seeing lights indicating kind of the wings of a craft in the shape of a football field, or the size of a football field in the shape of a triangle, like you'd expect an aircraft to be, but completely silent, not a sound in the sky. I mean, a normal sized plane you can
usually
hear.
Big things mean big sounds.
Yeah, exactly. Now, officials and investigators say that this was actually a group of ultralight aircraft enthusiasts who ended up liking the attention once the UFO stories started circulating. And several pilots actually have taken credit and said they were some of the guys who did these. But not everybody's convinced. The people who reported the sightings will go like, no, I know they said that it was them, but there's no way these were multiple aircraft because they were flying too close for it to be safe. They were
at the same speed, making the same maneuvers. It would be very difficult because they all reported it as if it was, at least the main ship was one object.
Right. Now, ultralight aircraft do make noise, but probably about as much as maybe a lawnmower. So it could be lost if they were flying high enough. And the other thing was this craft was reported as moving so slow, really slowly, or sometimes just hovering there completely, which isn't a thing that planes can do. But ultralights can fly really very slowly, a lot slower than a normal aircraft. So it's possible, but it would be really hard to fly ultralights in such a perfect formation that people below thought they were one object. So as with every story here, we're going to leave that on an open book. Let's talk about some other famous sightings and some more recent sightings. The US government has taken a slightly more open door stance in the last couple of years on UAP, incidents, and on what UFO enthusiasts like to term disclosure. So in April of 2020, in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Pentagon officially released and acknowledged 3 cockpit instrument videos from US Navy pilots who were seeing things they just couldn't explain. The videos had been leaked and circulating on the internet for years, and the Air Force at this point, I guess, just figured they were doing more harm than good by keeping them back. So, and yep, these happened. We have no idea. So on 2 of these, you can hear the pilots' reactions, which I think is pretty fun. This is from January 2015.
And again, these are Air Force pilots, right? Or Navy pilots.
Yeah,
so they're supposed to know what they see in the sky. Even
we'll see it like pivot.
Weapons and things like that. And they're completely bamboozled by this.
And then here's the other one. I like these guys play a little game of trying to catch this thing on a lock because it's moving too fast for their instruments.
And these are some of the most educated pilots you could get, and they really have no clue. They're just obviously completely blown away.
And this one is from 2004, November. Radio operators with the USS Nimitz nuclear carrier detected well over 100 objects in the same week. They were around 80,000 feet, which is very high. And they finally sent a couple pilots up there to intercept them and see what was going on. They found, and that was an image of one of the objects you were just seeing there. They described it as a 40-foot-long tic-tac shaped object. Sometimes they saw them very, very high up, but they also saw one flying low, 50 feet over the water. And they saw no wings and no obvious propulsion system. And like so many of these UFOs, they said the object was zigzagging, bouncing back and forth in an erratic way.
Impossibly fast, making impossible maneuvers.
Yeah. Now, in March of 2021, ufologists and UFO groups all over the country were throwing around the D word, disclosure, when media reports surfaced that the government was preparing an official report on UFOs. And a month after that, the Pentagon confirmed the authenticity of this video. It's from 2019, and it shows a reflective, triangular-shaped object just floating over a Navy destroyer.
So obviously very distressing to those on the destroyer. They don't know if this is from another country, a foreign power, if this is some sort of weapon, and they had no idea what it was.
Yeah, the UAP task force, because the US government has such a thing now, Congress created it in 2020, says they have no idea what this thing is. And the crewman who photographed it said he saw other objects, like there was a cube-shaped one and a spherical one at the same time hovering over that ship. Now, that long-awaited disclosure that we talked about came on June 25th, 2021, sort of, with the Pentagon UFO report. The preliminary assessment on unidentified aerial phenomenon from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is a lot less catchy.
And this is definitely what you were hearing in the news about UFOs and the Pentagon and Congress. Like, this is the report.
Well, even actually, most recently there was that that UFO whistleblower testifying before Congress.
Right. This was the initial
couple of years ago was this one. The task force looked at 144 UAP reports by U.S. military personnel. They were mostly Navy guys between 2004 and 2021. And of those 144 cases, the task force was able to confidently explain one of them. One of them was a large deflating balloon, the investigators decided, which is hilarious. But 18, the other ones all have no, like, we don't know. We don't know what it was.
And this is the Pentagon. They don't like saying they don't know.
No, and they hate it, in fact. And 18 of the 143 unexplained cases, they said, exhibited unusual flight patterns, like hovering or maneuvering abruptly or moving with considerable speed or acceleration in ways that our technology can't necessarily replicate, at least the tech that the guys who created this report know about. The Pentagon in the report concludes that there are probably many different phenomenon at work here. There could be some foreign technology involved. There could be some animals. And the report acknowledges that UAPs may pose a flight hazard and a potential security risk, although it doesn't come down firmly on the side that these are craft from another world, obviously. Let's see where we are on time. We've got 15 minutes. Let's run very quickly through some of our favorite abductees and contactees. There have been many thousands of reported UFO sightings over the years. That's just things from the sky of unknown origin. You know, they might not really be from other worlds. But over the years, some people have claimed to have seen these craft up close and even to have had direct contact with their pilots. George Adamski was the first person in the modern U.S. to claim that he had contacted beings from another planet. And I love talking about George Adamski. He's a fascinating, chaotic, neutral trickster god. He's like Loki if he sold hamburgers. So if in the late 1940s, George Adamski was a aspiring theosophist, which is to say he was an aspiring spiritual leader / scam artist. He claimed to be channeling sacred wisdom from ancient Tibetan masters who lived under the earth. And he also ran a hamburger stand. And in 1946, his spiritual lectures started taking a science fiction bent right around the time he started claiming to have seen hundreds of flying saucers during a meteor shower one night. Now, this was just before Kenneth Arnold. So in a way, George Adamski was a real innovator.
Sure.
But also, no one cared about UFOs in 1946, so nobody really paid any attention to his reports. But then after Arnold started getting all that attention the next summer, Adamski abruptly announced that he had seen his spacecraft again, but it was much closer this time, and he had clear photographic evidence. And that's George Adamski's saucer photo on the right. It definitely looks like your standard kind of movie flying saucer, although skeptics have claimed that it bears a suspicious similarity to a GE warming light for egg coops. So
yes, we wouldn't know, but you know, if anyone's an egg coop expert.
Oh, I've looked the light up. It is similar. I should have included a photo. You can Google that. The press had a field day debating this saucer photo. It's not like at the time everyone accepted it, and since people have been at the time it was like it was fun to debate, and people did in the media. But eventually the buzz started to die down, and George needed some new juice. And so in 1952, he hiked out into the desert with a couple of friends and met a man from Venus named Orthon.
Well, he said he did.
Carrie, I'd take this man at his. We're looking at it. That's a trustworthy face, if nothing else. Adamski describes Orthon as having blonde hair, tan skin, and vaguely Asian features, interestingly. And the alien telepathically explained to him where he was from and that he was here to warn humanity against the dangers of nuclear war.
It's also a big through line through a lot of these.
The saucer stories and the interest in saucers picks up in 47, right? So this is right after we enter the nuclear age, and a lot of the stories feature the aliens warning us against the dangers of nuclear technology. So after that, George Adamski was on a just life of book tours and speaking tours. He always spent his time talking about Orthon or joining Orthon for jaunts around the solar system and entertaining handsome extraterrestrial companions here on Earth. There's just seriously so much I could say about George Adamski. Our time is brief. He told a lot of lies, and we can't cover them all here today. But I love George Adamski. We did a podcast on him as well. Fascinating guy. Betty and Barney Hill. These are two people you may have heard of, even if you haven't heard of George Adamski. They were the first two people in the U.S. to claim abduction by a UFO. Our friend Mr. Adamski and a couple other people had claimed to have been, riding around the galaxy
consensually traveling
in UFOs.
Aliens.
But these were the first, and usually that was with, strangely, it was almost always handsome blonde male aliens who looked like just blonde guys.
Okay.
I don't know why the blonde hair is always there, but Betty and Barney were coming home from a trip to Niagara Falls and Montreal, and they saw what Betty at first thought was a falling star, but then it started to come back up and just streak across the sky, and falling stars don't usually do that. So Betty insisted Barney follow the light, and the Hills say they did until they finally caught up to it in a clearing where they saw an 80-foot disc hovering in the air about 100 feet above their car. Barney, and we once again think of the Berkshire's UFO incident at this point, said he heard a voice in his head telling him to stay calm. And he didn't like that at all. I don't like you speaking to me when I can't hear you. Yes. And he threw the car into reverse and they got the hell out of there. The rest of the trip passed more or less without incident, but when they got home, the Hills found it was hours later than they were expecting it to be. So we're back to lost time again. And as they talked it over, both Barney and Betty had hazy memories of a roadblock and a huge fiery orb resting on the ground in the middle of the forest. So after Betty suffered persistent nightmares about what modern readers would recognize as an alien abduction classic, and against Barney's great reluctance, I mean, it's hard to get guys to go to therapy now. Barney here back in the 1960s was not ready. So the couple did go to a psychiatrist who gave them hypnotic regression, and both of them claimed to remember gray alien creatures marching them from their car up a ramp and onto a ship and then separating them. Then Betty mostly recounted what she had already reported from her dreams, but in greater detail. She had a conversation with the alien leaders. There was a medical examination, including a 6-inch needle that they shoved into her belly button. And the aliens got confused over Barney's dentures. One of them came into the room and tugs on Betty's teeth.
Expecting them to come out because Barney's had.
And he goes, "Yours don't come out. His did." And Betty laughs and explains what dentures are. A little light humor in this otherwise pretty harrowing story. Now, Barney hadn't been having dreams up to this point, but he had deeply traumatic hypnotic regression sessions where he was screaming. There are recordings of this. You can listen to Barney break down and scream and cry, and the investigators have to frequently stop and give him a break. He claimed to remember a detailed physical exam, including the aliens extracting sperm from him and probing his anus, and that the butt probe comes up in
it's a cliche that we've all heard.
Basically every alien abduction story from here on out. Now, unlike George Adamski, I really think Betty and Barney Hill were telling the truth, and I don't think they were abducted by aliens, but I think they believed that they had this experience. And I think it's a story.
Well, you're very skeptical, Sean.
Yes, and that's kind of our whole vibe. But I think the power of suggestion, especially between two people, especially very close people. We've talked about folie à deux, Carrie, on our podcast, notably on our time slips episode, if you wanted to check that out. What was otherwise just kind of a spooky drive could have, through them kind of jazzing each other up, just become an almost psychedelic experience. Now,
I will add here, I think, to maybe counter a little bit, but certainly add a little context. You can see that they are an interracial couple. It's the early 60s. It's not an easy time to be an interracial couple. By all accounts, Barney and Betty, especially Barney, were very private. They did not want to make any waves. They did not want any attention on them. they already had negative attention on them just based on the fact that their skin colors were different.
Barney was involved in local government.
He was involved in local government, which again, pretty major for a Black man in the early 60s. And he's a very serious guy. They had nothing to gain from making these claims. And if anything, they had respect to lose from the people around them. So the fact that they did, and Betty was more interested in talking about her experience than Barney by far, but the fact that they did say that they had this experience definitely makes us believe that they believed it. And it's a very, very interesting situation, especially since it's so early on and you still have all of these tropes that we recognize today, but they're kind of the originators of those tropes, like the anal probe or the little gray alien men, things like that. There was really no frame of reference for that in the same way that there is today.
And it's really interesting how the same details come up over and over again in these UFO stories, and obviously you could either see that as, well, they're all seeing the same thing. It's evidence that there's a little more credence to these stories, or they, like Travis Walton, another abductee, almost certainly heard Betty and Barney's stories. And so
well, there had been a TV movie about Betty and Barney, which actually Barney is played by James Earl Jones in the movie, and that had been on TV before Travis Walton's experience. So he had definitely been exposed to the idea of alien abduction. But why don't you share what happened to Travis Walton, or at least what he says happened?
Yeah, so Travis was a logger. He was driving back to town with the rest of his crew on November 5th of 1975. And Travis says, and all 6 of his buddies corroborate, that they saw a light in the woods and drove to follow it, just like Barney and Betty. And when they got there was a saucer hovering in the air, just like Barney and Betty. Now, Travis says he felt compelled to jump out of the moving truck and get close to this thing. And so he did. We jumped out of the moving car. His friends go, Travis, what the hell? And then a bolt of light, as he moved toward the craft, a bolt of light shot out of it and knocked him back about 10 feet and to the ground. His friends just see Travis hit by this bolt, stagger, and fall limply. They thought he was dead and just left. Immediately.
Well, they were terrified too. They're in the middle of the forest.
They only came back to check on Travis after they saw the light streak off into the distance, and by that time, Travis was gone. Now, Travis claims the next thing he remembers, he was on a table in a triangular room with some puffy white marshmallowy aliens with huge eyes. I love when the form factor of the aliens changes. I like when somebody's a little creative with they're not just the blonde guys or the big head, big eye guys. So puffy marshmallow aliens. Travis fought these guys off because they were really weak and light. So he would punch them and they would just go flying back. And so he escaped, but then he ran into some, you guessed it, sexy blonde guys, just human looking guys with long blonde hair, who put him on a table and knocked him out with a gas mask, presumably to experiment on him some more. And the next time Travis Walton woke up, he says he was on the pavement outside of town, lying on his back, and his clothes were on backward.
And it had been days.
It had been 5 days.
Yeah, so he straight up disappeared from his logging job that his friends saw him disappear for 5 days, for most of a week, and no one knows where he went, if he was abducted, or if not, where could he have been? He had been in the middle of the woods when he disappeared. So it's a very interesting story.
The guys argued to the logging company that they couldn't finish the job they were doing because they were looking for Travis, and basically pled alien abduction. You got to pay us for the job anyway. They didn't successfully make those arguments, and people have observed that they probably weren't going to be able to finish the job anyway.
But again, where did Travis go for most of the week?
Out of town.
Well, we'll see.
This was all, if you want to see more about Travis Walton, this was all made into a weird, pretty gnarly sci-fi B movie called Fire in the Sky in the early 90s. It is worth tracking down if you like your slow plotting mysteries to end with really visceral body horror for 25 minutes.
Yeah, well, they really go into the whole alien experimentation thing visually.
It's if you just want that part, actually look up if you search Fire in the Sky on YouTube, you'll get it. It is a really pretty harrowing alien abduction scene. Anyway, that is it for us, but I would love to get to some questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any, we are happy to answer for you. And this is just a very, very brief overview of the history of UFOs, but there's so many more stories out there. We definitely suggest you check them out if you're interested in this whole topic.
Yeah. If any of those last 3 stories in particular caught your fancy too, we have full episodes on those guys.
Any questions from anybody? Find the James Earl Jones thing quite intriguing myself. Not gonna lie.
Yeah, it's supposed to be I mean, it might be harder to find because it was a TV movie, I think, but it's supposed to be very good and a good performance, but it's a fascinating story for sure. And based in New Hampshire, there's a little side of the road sort of plaque that you can go drive by, the Betty and Barney Hill incident on there, so you can see where they were supposedly abducted in real life.
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed when we had their photo up, but we also love them because they had a dachshund.
We have one
I
as well.
noticed that. We do have a question. Was there something that happened in Exeter, New Hampshire? Does that sound familiar?
Yes. Well, Exeter has the UFO festival. So New Hampshire is kind of like, I guess you could say, the New England hub of UFOs. You know, it's our mini Roswell. So there have been a bunch of UFO incidents in and around New Hampshire. I think we discussed some. We talked about New England UFOs on another episode of our show. But yeah, the Exeter incident. Yes, there were several sightings. It was kind of similar to the Berkshires incident. Happened around the same time, interestingly enough, September 3rd, 1965. It's around the Exeter area, and there had been several separate sightings at that time made by numerous witnesses in the weeks leading up to the event, and then the main sighting on the 3rd, which involved a local teenager and 2 police officers. And we definitely talked about this one. We have a New England UFOs episode. But again, it's one of those things where the police is involved. They might have hands-on experience in this. They witnessed certain aspects of this sighting and this situation, so it adds a little more credence to the story when the police officers are saying, no, I saw this weird thing, or this weird thing happened to me. So yeah, Exeter is a really interesting hotspot, and then you could go to the Exeter UFO Festival and check that out.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Do we have any more questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Just another plug to learn anything you can about George Adamski. He's really my favorite subject.
And if you do end up having any other questions, you can go to our website and shoot us a message, or email us at ain'titscary@gmail.com, and we'd be happy to chat anything UFO or otherwise.
Yeah, you could also call 666-5329.
Yes,
203-666-5529.
5529. That's our Google Voice number. But yeah, cool. Keep an eye on the skies, of course.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sean and Carrie. That was really cool. I want to let everyone know I'm putting 2 links in the chat because we do have 2 important things I want to note about the upcoming eclipse, which is on October 11th. We have our solar eclipse trivia night at 6 p.m. And we will be, I believe we are, or will be, able to give out free eclipse glasses to those who register through the other links that I posted here. And that is also in our events calendar. It's actually under the date for September 14th, but if you follow this link, you can go there and register to get 1 pair of glasses per family. and check out everything else we've got coming up. There's lots of resources in our events calendar as well to learn about the upcoming eclipse. And thank you very much for your website as well in the chat.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you again.
I shared the screen the whole time I was copying the link, so I might as well actually get it.
Yeah, there we go. Easy to click on. All right. Thank you so much. It was lovely to have you. And thank you to everyone who attended and for your interest. And maybe we'll see you again sometime.
We would love
Absolutely.
that. Thank
Thanks
you
for
very
having
much.
us.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye.